Article 2 ECHR. I am beginning to realize it might be ECHR, but I will just have to excuse my mistake here. The right to a life also applies to the EU stature, aka stadgan. Just good to know when it comes to circumstances ascertaining to EU cases. Anything within the EU also guarantees the right to life. Great to know. Absolutely necessitated, thereby any case of death can be brought up to the court. Any court, national or even supranational. This is usually pretty easy to understand, just intuitively. If someone is dead and someone wants to know about why they're dead, you're gonna get a case about it. Usually suffices, which is one of the few cases, for good reasons, where the case or the court doesn't really have to question themselves or the national courts in how they should proceed with these issues, which usually can become a hard part of generalized courts or supranational courts. But with this case, yeah, if someone is dead and you don't know the cause, of course, you can go to the courts. And then Protocol 6, abolition of death penalty, exempt crises. This was brought in like a couple decades, if not less, or not if even a little more, after the Second World War. First, they took away the prohibition of death, which was pretty easily breached if you wanted to at the time. However, they weren't able to give any better deals to each other due to the climate of the world at the time. You need to remember this was just a few years after World War II, and as people probably was thinking back then, World War I was meant to be the world to end all wars, and then you have World War II, and then you have the first 10 to 20 years after that, and usually you're going to be pretty careful with the things that you're promising. So yeah, Protocol 6 took its time because, states were still pretty extreme, or they were still connected to those periods of times where they're more extreme, where things like penalty deaths were pretty given for certain excuses. And then Protocol 13 added later on, abolishing death penalty in all circumstances, meaning Protocol 6 added the idea that you can take away death penalties, but you can still use it upon people that sort of blend into the ideas of remedying a crisis, let's say then a diplomatic one, which at the time was more normalized. Now maybe you wouldn't find France killing a Russian spy in public. And then Protocol 13, it meant that you couldn't do it in any circumstance. And now these ideas of wartime and the idea of how death penalties should work, this is usually only put into the territories of the countries from which they are within. I know that in doctrine they talk about how a nation can still be made responsible of territories that are outside of their own sovereign borders. However, there are cases where if you did draw let's say a sequence of events, and you could usually bring some ideas of breaches from Article 2 back to a nation. However, these ideas would have to be of proxies, meaning they wouldn't apply to Article 2. Unfortunately, the idea of how states sort of indirectly comply to systematic genocides or just systems which isolate certain groups while they increase the benefit of another, these ideas don't really apply to Article 2, or if for that case, any article. Anything that it's outside the reach of bureaucratic language, institutional structures, you won't be able to bring into these ideas. So yeah, great. And then you have the text, everyone's right to life shall be protected by law. No one shall be deprived of his life intentionally, save in the execution of a sentence of a court following his conviction of a crime for which this penalty is provided by law. Deprivation of life shall not be regarded as inflicted in contravention of this article when it results from the use of force which is no more than absolutely necessary to A, be in defense of any person from unlawful violence, B, in order to effect a lawful arrest or to prevent even the escape of a person lawfully detained, or C, an action lawfully taken for the purpose of quelling a riot or insurrection. As you can see, these sentences are scarily generalized, but that's just how it has to go, especially with the nations that they have to abide by. Yeah, obviously, like if you're from Sweden, some of these exemptions are ridiculous, and if they ever were to be applied, it would have to be in dire situations, which usually doesn't happen, not at least in the Nordic, aka Scandinavian areas from which I study from.